Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Dan, and well, this film is honestly one of my favorite older horror films. Um, The Fly from 1958. Now, a lot of people who saw it when they were either very young or have not actually seen it are under the impression that A, it's a black and white film, which is untrue because this was filmed in color. Um, However, the sequel, The Return of the Fly, was filmed in black and white. Um, but this one was in color. Also, B, a lot of people think that Vincent Price, who stars in the film, was the scientist who turned himself into the fly, but that's not actually true. That was David Hedison who played Andre, and he actually went by the name of Al Hedison for the film. I'm not really sure why, but David Hedison was his name. Um, but this came out in 1958, um, and there was kind of a big change during the late 40s and all throughout the 50s in horror films. And that was due to the advent of the hydrogen bomb and the devastating effects that it showed in uh, Nagasaki and Hiroshima when the bombs fell during World War II. Um, it's an interesting change because they really kind of turned horror films into sci-fi horror films, and that genre really kind of began right around this time. Obviously, films like Godzilla, the original from Japan, and Tarantula, things like that. Like with the most of them had to do with giant animals or insects of some kind that were ravaging a town due to science gone awry. Um, but in this case, in this film, what happens is it starts off with actually a really vivid and horrific image for a film of its time. There's a metal press that is all the way down, and blood is just seeping out of it, and there's a body, its head and arm inside of the metal press that's been completely crushed. And some folks look at the metal press and they see that it was actually pressed down twice, so they're concerned. Obviously this couldn't be a suicide. They wouldn't, somebody wouldn't have crushed their skull and then gone back and hit the thing again and then ran back there and got back underneath of it. So they figure out, they realize, okay, yes, this is, this scientist, Andre, and his brother um, is played by Vincent Price. So the police call him in and they're investigating and things like that. And there's an interesting scene where his Andre's wife is freaking out because this maid had killed a fly in the room. She got really upset by this, but she wouldn't say why. So anyway, she went. Um, she's laying in bed because she's nauseous and just unwell, and she finally tells Francois, played by um, Vincent Price, the reason why this happened, and that yes, she did um, kill him, but she's not a murderer. This, that, and the other things. So basically, Andre, in their basement in his lab, had created a teleportation device that could teleport an object from one pod to another. and he shows her with an ashtray that goes across, but then he takes the ashtray out, and the "Made in Japan" label is written backwards after it gets transported. Well, he decides he has some more work to do, so he's busy working in his lab. And his lab is great, by the way. It's really kind of the quintessential, um, you know, science fiction horror film laboratory. With there's a reel-to-reel machine back on the wall that just it really doesn't serve any purpose other than to look really interesting, and the reels spin around and all that stuff. There's neon tubing that's bent in all kinds of strange shapes that you know the neon gas goes through and lights up in various colors and things like that. And you know obviously the big panels full of lights that just kind of like move across the wall and things like that. It's just so cheesily science fiction. There's like random junk pieces and everything of stuff laying all about and everything. It's great. It's such a fantastically designed laboratory. So he keeps working on things, and then the family cat comes down, and now that he's got all the kinks taken out of it and he's done it a few times and nothing's coming through backwards anymore, he he decides to put the cat in with a saucer of milk. And the saucer of milk transfers through, but the cat doesn't come back through the other thing. And he just kind of, you hear this haunting meowing kind of emanating from thin air. Like, it's kind of terrifying. Um, but eventually, after she hasn't seen him for quite some time working down in the lab, she goes down there, and he just kind of like, slides a note under the door, telling her not to come in, and that, he can't speak. He'll knock once for yes and twice for no. She needs to knock 3 times if she understands. Bring him food, this, that, and the other thing. And finally, when she brings him food, he opens up the door, and he's wearing this black, like cloth over his head, and he's got his arm, his hand down into his laboratory coat pocket. And so this goes on and on and on, and he tells her, well, he types on a typewriter, that there's a fly that has a white head. You need to find it. I went through the machine, and I didn't realize that there was a fly in there with me. There was a mistake, and now I need that fly back to be able to go back to my normal self. So she's looking everywhere for the fly. She's got their son Philippe looking out for the fly. Eventually, there's a point where they find it in one of the rooms, and they manage to kind of like trap it behind the drapes so that she can, get something to get it. But there's a crack in the window pane, and it flies through and goes outside. He eventually, or she goes down there to tell him about this, and she's so upset and everything, and she manages eventually to pull off his, hood thing basically that he's wearing. And yeah, he's got a fly head, he's got a fly hand, like, basically it's meant that, like, the entire, like, from here down to here, everything above that is all fly. So she freaks out naturally and passes out, and he gets aggravated and just destroys all of his work. And then she comes to, and he just grabs some chalk, because he's been telling her that, like, he can't think clearly, he can't think straight. So obviously, his brain is starting to revert to that of the fly brain. And there's actually great stuff. His arm, his fly arm, like, just kind of moves uncontrollably and knocks things over and, hits things and stuff like that. And, he has to, like, grab it and bring it down and stuff it back into the pocket and everything, because he's just not thinking like a human is anymore. And he doesn't have his own will anymore, because, he's getting the fly brain, basically. So, he ends up, destroying everything, and he grabs some chalk and starts writing on a chalkboard that, she has to kill the fly. She has to help him, but she can't come near him. And, he loves her. So then he burns all of his notes, everything, and has her come out to his brother's factory where there's the metal press, and you know he just kind of puts his head down in there, and she, he kind of like shows her how to use the machine real quick, puts his head down in there, and has her, press the button and crush his skull, well, his head, fly head, and then it rises back up, and she goes in and she puts, his fly arm in there and crushes just like, the whole top part of his body so that there's no evidence of this ever having happened. So, she finishes up this story, and the police inspector thinks, she's obviously nuts, and, she's going to go ahead and have her arrested. But he says, the only way that you could actually prove this to me is if I were to actually see that fly, and by that point, this is impossible. So the police come to arrest her, and, Philippe is there, the son, and she doesn't want him to see her like that, so she has Vincent Price leave and go, like, bring him downstairs. And the kid, as they're talking, just kind of says, "Oh, I saw that weird fly again that Mommy was looking for." And he's just like, "Wait, what?" And the kid's like, "Yeah, it's out in this, spider web out there." So he runs back and has the inspector come out with him to see the fly, and you can see the spider getting closer to the fly, and sure enough, the fly has, a human upper like torso attached where the head was, and it's screaming for help and everything like that. So obviously the fly is starting to get like human brain and is freaking out about this. And so the inspector does the only thing that he can really do: grabs a rock, throws it at it, kills the spider and the fly. At that point, he's basically just as much of a murderer as she is, so he can't very well arrest her. And that's pretty much the end of the film. It's a really good 1950s sci-fi horror film. And of course, there was a sequel made in the 80s. So we will get to that tomorrow. Stay tuned.